The Wounded Bird. The autumn rain of 1,944 fell in sheets across the American airbase at Thorpe Abbotts, England, turning the tarmac into a mirror of slate-gray sky. Major Robert Hennigan stood beneath the belly of the B-17 Flying Fortress, staring up at the gaping wound in its fuselage with the kind of desperation that comes from running out of options. The bomber, christened Liberty's Last Dance by her original crew, sat like a wounded bird among the neat rows of operational aircraft, a stark reminder that even the mightiest machines could be brought low. "It's impossible, sir," said Captain James Wheeler, the base's chief maintenance officer, wiping oil from his hands with a rag that had long since given up any pretense of cleanliness. "We've had 3 different teams look at her. The main spar is cracked, the hydraulics are shot to hell, and there's structural damage to the wing root that I've never seen before. She took a direct hit from an 88 millimeters over Bremen, and frankly, I'm amazed she made it back at all." Hennigan knew Wheeler wasn't exaggerating. He'd watched Liberty's Last Dance limp home 2 weeks ago, trailing smoke and losing altitude, her number 3 engine dead and her landing gear deployed by emergency measures. The landing had been controlled chaos, a testament to the skill of her pilot, Lieutenant Morrison, who had died 3 days later from wounds sustained in the mission. The rest of the crew had been reassigned, but the bomber remained a problem no one could solve. The major walked slowly around the aircraft, his footsteps echoing in the vast hangar. The B-17 was more than just a machine to him. These bombers were the backbone of the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, and every aircraft that couldn't fly meant fewer bombs on target, fewer escort fighters protected, fewer chances to end this war. Command had been pressing him for answers, and he'd been stalling, hoping for a miracle. "What about salvage?" Hennigan asked, though the words tasted bitter. Wheeler shook his head. "We've stripped what we can use for other aircraft. But the airframe itself? Sir, we need to rebuild half the plane. We don't have the facilities, we don't have the time, and honestly, we don't have anyone with the expertise to tackle damage this extensive. The engineering manual doesn't cover something like this." The rain intensified, drumming on the hangar roof like distant machine gun fire. Hennigan thought about the 20 other B-17s on the base, all operational, all needed for the massive raid scheduled for the end of the month. But Liberty's Last Dance had been special. She'd completed 31 missions without losing a single crew member to enemy action, a record that had made her legendary among the men. Morrison had been planning her 32nd mission when Bremen happened. "There has to be someone," Hennigan muttered, more to himself than to Wheeler. "Someone who's seen this kind of damage before, someone who knows these birds inside and out." Wheeler was about to respond when the hangar door opened with a metallic groan. A figure stood silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, water dripping from a worn leather jacket. The man was shorter than average, with grease-stained hands and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He carried a battered toolbox that looked like it had survived its own war. "Heard you boys got yourself a problem," the man said, his voice carrying a thick Brooklyn accent that seemed out of place in the formal military environment. "Name's Frank Cassidy. They tell me you got a fort that nobody can fix." Hennigan and Wheeler exchanged glances. The major's first instinct was to have this stranger escorted off the base, but something about the man's bearing, the confidence in his stance, made him hesitate. "Who exactly are you, Mr. Cassidy?" Hennigan asked. Cassidy set down his toolbox and pulled out a cigarette, not lighting it, just rolling it between his fingers. "Sergeant Frank Cassidy, sir. Well, former sergeant. I was with the maintenance crews on Omaha Beach, D-Day +1. Kept the birds flying while we were still dodging artillery fire. Before that, I was building these forts at Boeing in Seattle. Worked on the production line for 2 years before I enlisted." He walked toward the B-17, his eyes scanning the damage with the practiced gaze of someone who'd seen worse. "Heard through the grapevine you got a bird here that stumped everyone. Figure I'd come take a look. I owe Morrison. We flew together once back in training." Wheeler bristled at the informal approach, but Hennigan held up a hand. There was something about Cassidy, something that spoke of hard-won experience and skills that couldn't be learned from any manual. "You think you can fix her?" Hennigan asked. Cassidy finally lit his cigarette, took a long drag, and smiled. Major, I don't think. I know. Give me 2 weeks and a good crew, and I'll have this bird singing like she's fresh off the assembly line. But I'm going to need you to trust me and let me work my way. The major looked at the wounded bomber, then back at this unlikely savior. Sometimes he knew you had to take chances. The war had taught him that much. You've got 1 week, Hennigan said. After that, we salvage her for parts. Cassidy's smile widened. 1 week it is. You won't regret this, sir. The assessment. Dawn broke reluctantly over Thorpe Abbott's, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that seemed too beautiful for a world at war. Frank Cassidy had been awake for hours, circling Liberty's last dance, like a surgeon examining a patient before a critical operation. He'd sent word the previous evening requesting a crew of mechanics willing to work under his direction. And now 6 men stood before him in the cold morning air, their breath forming clouds in the autumn chill. Gentlemen, Cassidy began, stubbing out his 4th cigarette of the morning, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. What we're about to attempt, most people would call impossible. The men who worked on this bird before you were good mechanics, probably some of the best you got on this base. They looked at this damage and saw 1,000 reasons why she can't be fixed. I'm here to show you the one reason why she can. The youngest of the group, a corporal named Billy Hendrick from somewhere in Kansas, raised his hand tentatively. Sir, I was on one of the teams that assessed the damage. The main spar has a fracture that runs almost 3 feet along the wing root. The stress calculations alone suggest that even if we could repair it, the wing wouldn't hold up to combat conditions. Cassidy nodded approvingly. Good. You've got eyes, and you can read a manual. But tell me something, Corporal. Have you ever seen AB-17 take off with one engine out, half her tail section missing, and holes in her wings big enough to throw a football through? No, sir. I have. I've seen these birds do things that would make a slide rule weep. The manual tells you what these planes are supposed to do. I'm going to show you what they actually can do. He turned to the group. Now, let's get to work. We've got 7 days to do what everyone says can't be done. The first 3 hours were spent simply documenting every aspect of the damage. Cassidy insisted on photographing each problem area, taking measurements, and creating detailed sketches. He moved around the aircraft with an almost reverent attention to detail, running his hands along damaged sections, tapping on panels with his knuckles, listening to sounds that the others couldn't distinguish from ordinary echoes. The main spar is cracked, yes, Cassidy explained to the gathered crew as they stood beneath the damaged wing. But it's not broken. There's a difference. A broken spar means you need a new wing. A cracked spar means you need to understand how stress travels through metal and how to redirect that stress away from the weak point. He pointed to the fracture line. See how the crack runs at an angle here? That's because the impact that caused it came from below and slightly forward. The German 88 that hit her probably detonated about 30 feet away, sent shrapnel up and into the wing. But the main force of the explosion was absorbed by the lower fuselage sections. That's why she's still in one piece. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, a veteran mechanic from Texas with 15 years of aircraft experience, leaned in closer. So what's your plan? We can't weld the main spar. The heat would compromise the integrity of the entire structure. You're right, we can't weld it. But we can sister it. Cassidy pulled out a battered notebook filled with sketches and calculations. We're going to fabricate reinforcement plates that will run along both sides of the spar, extending 2 feet beyond the crack in each direction. We'll use high-tensile steel bolts at specific stress points to create a new load path. The crack will still be there, but it won't be bearing the weight anymore. The crew exchanged skeptical glances, but there was something in Cassidy's confidence that was infectious. He spoke with the authority of someone who had seen these techniques work under conditions far worse than a relatively safe English airbase. What about the hydraulics? Asked another mechanic, Sergeant Lou Martinelli from New Jersey. The entire system is contaminated with debris. We need to flush and replace most of the lines. Cassidy nodded. We do that second. Once the structural integrity is restored, we tackle the systems. Hydraulics, electrical, control surfaces, in that order. Each system depends on the one before it. You fix them out of sequence, and you'll just create new problems. As the morning wore on, Cassidy's crew began to see the method in his approach. He wasn't just fixing damage. He was reimagining how the aircraft's systems interacted, finding ways to strengthen the repairs beyond their original specifications. He had them remove panels that seemed unrelated to the obvious damage, revealing hidden stress fractures and potential failure points that the previous teams had missed. "This is why she's still here," Cassidy explained, pointing to a hairline crack in a support bracket. "The other teams saw the big damage and missed the small stuff. But it's the small stuff that kills you at 20,000 feet. We fix everything, or we fix nothing." By noon, they had a complete assessment documented in Cassidy's growing notebook. The damage was extensive, but his systematic approach had revealed something the previous teams had missed, a pattern to how the aircraft had absorbed and distributed the impact forces. Understanding this pattern was the key to effective repair. "All right, gentlemen," Cassidy said as they broke for lunch. "Tomorrow we start fabrication. Cole, you and Hendricks will work with me on the spar reinforcement plates. Martinelli, I need you to start mapping out the hydraulic system. Every line, every connection point. The rest of you will be stripping damaged sections and preparing surfaces for repair. We've got 6 days left, and I meant what I said to the Major. This bird will fly." As the crew dispersed, Cole lingered behind. "Mr. Cassidy, can I ask you something?" "Frank. Call me Frank." "Frank, then. You really think we can pull this off? I've been working on aircraft since before the war, and I've never seen damage like this successfully repaired in the field." Cassidy looked up at the bomber, his expression thoughtful. "Marcus, on D-Day +1, I was on Omaha Beach with artillery rounds landing close enough to feel the heat. We had AP-47 Thunderbolt that had made an emergency landing on the beach with its entire tail section hanging on by cables and prayers. Command said to salvage it for parts. But I knew that pilot needed his bird back, and I knew our boys in the hedgerows needed close air support. So I fixed it using scrap metal from a destroyed German half-track and a welding torch that kept going out because of the sea spray." He turned to Cole with steel in his eyes. "That Thunderbolt flew 60 more missions. Never once did my repair fail. So yes, Marcus, I know we can do this. The question isn't can we, it's will we have the courage to try what everyone else has said is impossible." Cole nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "1 week. Let's make a miracle happen." Steel and determination. The fabrication of the reinforcement plates began at 0500 hours the next morning, in a corner of the maintenance hangar that Cassidy had commandeered for his operation. The space was cramped and cold, but had access to the tools they needed. A bandsaw, a drill press, grinding wheels, and most importantly, sheets of high-tensile steel that Cassidy had somehow procured from the base's emergency reserves. "Measure twice, cut once," Cassidy reminded Hendricks as the young corporal marked out the first template on a sheet of steel. "These plates need to be perfect. We're not just patching a hole. We're rebuilding the structural skeleton of this aircraft." The work was painstaking. Each reinforcement plate had to be precisely curved to match the contour of the wing's interior structure, with bolt holes positioned to distribute stress evenly across the repair. Cassidy worked alongside his crew, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this type of work 1,000 times before, but his eyes constantly checked and rechecked every measurement, every cut, every angle. By mid-morning, they had completed the first plate. Cassidy held it up to the light, examining it from every angle, running his fingers along the edges to feel for any imperfections that might become failure points under stress. "Good," he finally pronounced. "Now we need 3 more just like it, and then the smaller reinforcement pieces for the secondary stress points." While the fabrication work continued, Martinelli had assembled a team to tackle the hydraulic system. The contamination was worse than initially thought. Debris from the explosion had been forced through the lines under pressure, scoring the interior of the pipes and embedding itself in the hydraulic fluid reservoir. "Frank, we've got a problem," Martinelli called out from beneath the aircraft. "The main hydraulic pump housing has fractures. Even if we flush the system, it's not going to hold pressure. We need a replacement, and there isn't one on the base." Cassidy climbed down from the wing where he'd been working and examined the damaged pump. His face remained impassive, but inside, he was calculating options. They had 5 days left, and a replacement part would take at least a week to arrive from supply, assuming one could even be located. "Can you rebuild it?" Cassidy asked. Martinelli shook his head. "The housing itself is cast aluminum. You can't weld it without compromising the tolerances. And we need machine shop equipment we don't have." Cassidy was quiet for a moment, thinking, then his face brightened. "We don't rebuild it. We reinforce it. Cole, I need you over here." When Cole arrived, Cassidy outlined his plan. They would create an external housing around the damaged pump, essentially building a pressure vessel within a pressure vessel. Using steel bands and high-pressure sealant compounds, they could contain the hydraulic pressure and route it around the fractures. That's actually brilliant," Martinelli said slowly. "Unconventional as hell, but it should work. The pump will weigh more, which might affect the flight characteristics slightly, but it's better than a bomber that can't lower its landing gear," Cassidy finished. "Get started on it. We've lost 2 hours already." The days began to blur together into a continuous cycle of work, brief rest, and more work. Cassidy seemed to run on cigarettes and coffee, catching 3 or 4 hours of sleep each night on a cot he'd set up in the hangar. The rest of the crew, inspired by his dedication and increasingly convinced that his unorthodox methods might actually succeed, pushed themselves to match his pace. On the morning of the 3rd day, they began the critical task of installing the reinforcement plates on the main spar. This required jacking up the wing to relieve stress on the structure, positioning the plates with perfect precision, and drilling through both the original spar and the reinforcement plates simultaneously to ensure perfect alignment of the bolt holes. "Steady," Cassidy murmured as Hendricks operated the drill press while Cole and another mechanic held the heavy plates in position. "We drill slow and steady. If this bit catches wrong, we could crack the spar further." Sweat ran down Hendricks's face despite the cold hangar air. The drill bit slowly chewed through the steel, creating a perfectly round hole. "One down. 37 more to go." Major Hennigan visited the hangar that afternoon, accompanied by Captain Wheeler. They'd been monitoring progress from a distance, and the Major's expression was skeptical as he examined the work. "This looks improvised," Hennigan said, running his hand along one of the installed reinforcement plates. "It is improvised, sir," Cassidy replied, not offended. "Every repair in combat conditions is improvised. The question isn't whether it looks pretty. The question is whether it works and whether it's safe." Wheeler pointed to the hydraulic pump modification. "This isn't in any maintenance manual I've ever seen." "No, sir, it isn't. But then, the damage this aircraft sustained isn't in any manual either. We're solving problems that the engineers who designed these planes never anticipated. That requires thinking beyond the manual." Hennigan walked around the aircraft, noting the progress. The main structural repairs were nearly complete. The hydraulic system was being reassembled with Martinelli's modified pump. Teams were working on the electrical system, replacing damaged wiring and components. Against all odds, it looked like Cassidy might actually succeed. "How much longer?" the Major asked. "We'll have her buttoned up by tomorrow evening. Then we need a full day for systems checks and testing. If everything works as planned, she'll be ready for a test flight the morning of day 7. And if it doesn't work as planned?" Cassidy met the Major's eyes steadily. "Then I'll have learned something new about B-17s, and you'll have a bomber to salvage." "But it'll work, sir. I've staked my reputation on it." After the officers left, Cole approached Cassidy. "You really put yourself out there with the Major. What if something goes wrong?" Cassidy lit another cigarette, his hands steady. "Marcus, you know what I learned on Omaha Beach? Sometimes you have to commit completely. No half measures, no backup plans. The moment you start planning for failure, you've already failed. We're going to make this work because there's no other option in our minds." That night, as the crew worked under portable lights that cast long shadows across the hangar floor, Cassidy allowed himself a moment of reflection. The repair was coming together better than he'd hoped. The reinforcement plates were solid. The hydraulic system was holding pressure in testing, and the 1,000 small fixes they'd made throughout the aircraft were addressing problems that could have caused catastrophic failures down the line. But the real test was still to come. A bomber that looked good on the ground meant nothing if she couldn't fly. And there were still 3 days of work ahead, 3 days in which any number of complications could arise. "Frank, we've got all the bolts torqued on the port side reinforcement," Hendricks reported, interrupting his thoughts. "Starting on the starboard side now." Cassidy nodded. "Good work, Billy. Remember, consistent torque on every bolt. We're creating a structure that's stronger than the original, but only if we do it right." As Hendricks returned to work, Cassidy looked up at Liberty's last dance, at her wounded but unbroken frame. In 3 days, she would either fly again or become another statistic in a war full of broken machines and broken dreams. He stubbed out his cigarette and picked up his tools. There was still work to do. The devil in the details. Day 4 began with a crisis. At 0615 hours, Sergeant Martinelli discovered that the modified hydraulic pump, which had tested perfectly the previous evening, was now showing a slow pressure leak. Somewhere in the system, hydraulic fluid was escaping, and they had less than 72 hours to find and fix it before the scheduled test flight. "Frank, I've checked every connection point, every seal," Martinelli said, frustration evident in his voice. "The pressure holds for about 20 minutes, then starts dropping. It's slow, but it's there. If this were in combat conditions, the gear might fail to extend." Cassidy knelt beneath the aircraft, his experienced eyes scanning the complex network of hydraulic lines that ran like arteries through the bomber structure. A slow leak was often harder to find than a catastrophic failure because it meant the problem was small, perhaps a microscopic flaw in a seal or a hairline crack in a fitting that only opened under pressure. "Did you pressurize the system and use soap solution to look for bubbles?" Cassidy asked. "First thing I tried. Nothing visible." Cassidy thought for a moment. "Then it's not at a connection point. It's in the lines themselves. We're going to have to trace every inch of the hydraulic system. Cole, give me a pressure gauge with a precision dial. Martinelli, you're going to section off the system. We'll isolate each segment and test it separately until we find where the pressure loss is occurring." The painstaking process took 6 hours. They divided the hydraulic system into segments, pressurized each section individually, and monitored the pressure over time. It was tedious work that required absolute attention to detail, but gradually they narrowed down the problem to a 20-foot section of line that ran through the wing root, precisely where the aircraft had taken the most damage. "There," Cassidy said, pointing to a section of hydraulic line that looked perfectly intact from the outside. The explosion probably sent a pressure wave through the fluid that damaged the interior of the line. The outside looks fine, but inside, there's probably a split or a weakness that's letting fluid seep into the surrounding structure. "So we replace this section?" Martinelli asked. "We replace this section," Cassidy confirmed. "And while we're at it, we replace every hydraulic line that runs through the damaged area. I'm not taking chances. If one line is compromised, others might be too, just not showing symptoms yet." By early evening, they had rerouted and replaced nearly 30 feet of hydraulic lines, using every spare part they could find on the base. The work required removing panels they'd already reinstalled, disrupting other repairs, and generally throwing their carefully planned schedule into chaos. But Cassidy insisted on doing it right. "Gentlemen, I know we're behind schedule," he told the exhausted crew as they gathered for a brief dinner break. "But I need you to understand something. Every shortcut we don't take now is a life we might save later. The crew that flies this bird needs to know that she's as sound as the day she left the factory. More sound, actually, because we know what she's been through and we've strengthened her where she was weak." While the hydraulic repair consumed most of the day, other teams continued work on the remaining systems. The electrical system had proven to be more damaged than initially assessed, with several circuits showing intermittent failures that could only be detected during powered tests. Hendricks and another mechanic spent hours tracing wires, replacing damaged sections, and ensuring that every circuit had proper grounding and insulation. "Frank, I found something weird," Hendricks called out from deep within the aircraft's interior. "There's a circuit here that's been bypassed. Looks like it was done before the mission where she got hit. Someone rigged a workaround that's not standard." Cassidy crawled into the cramped space to examine Hendricks's finding. Sure enough, Someone had created a jury-rigged bypass around what appeared to be a faulty circuit breaker. It was the kind of field-expedient repair that combat crews sometimes made to keep a bomber flying, but it wasn't safe and it violated multiple regulations. "Good catch, Billy," Cassidy said. "This is exactly the kind of thing that looks fine until it doesn't. We'll rip this out and do it properly. While we're at it, we'll inspect every circuit breaker and switch in the aircraft. If this crew was taking shortcuts, there might be others." The discovery led to another 3 hours of inspection work, and they found 2 more improvised repairs that needed to be corrected. Each discovery pushed their schedule further back, but Cassidy never wavered in his insistence on thoroughness. By midnight, the crew was running on adrenaline and determination. They'd been working for 18 hours straight, and exhaustion was beginning to show in slower reaction times and small mistakes that had to be corrected. Cassidy finally called a halt. "All right, everyone out," he ordered. "Get 6 hours of sleep. We'll resume at 0700. You can't do good work when you're this tired, and I need you sharp for what comes next." There were a few grumbles, but mostly relief. The crew staggered off to their barracks while Cassidy remained behind, walking around Liberty's last dance one more time, his flashlight beam playing over the repairs they'd made. He mentally reviewed their progress. Structural repairs complete and solid, hydraulic system repaired and being retested, electrical system being systematically overhauled. They still had the control surfaces to address, the engines to test, and 100 smaller items on his checklist. 2.5 days left. It was going to be close. The next morning brought better news. The hydraulic system held pressure perfectly through a 12-hour overnight test. Martinelli was cautiously optimistic that they'd solved the leak problem. The electrical teams reported that all critical circuits were now functioning to specification, with backup systems tested and verified. "Today we focus on the control surfaces," Cassidy announced to the morning briefing. "I want every cable tensioned, every pulley bearing checked, every connection point inspected. The structural repairs don't mean anything if the pilots can't control the aircraft." This work required a different kind of precision. The B-17's control system was entirely mechanical, cables running through pulleys that connected the pilot's yoke and rudder pedals to the control surfaces on the wings and tail. The explosion that had damaged the bomber had thrown everything out of alignment, and over the past 2 weeks, cables had stretched and settled into new positions. Cassidy personally oversaw the tensioning of each control cable, using a specialized tool to measure the exact tension in pounds of force. Too loose, and the controls would be mushy and unresponsive. Too tight, and they would bind or break under stress. The manual specified acceptable ranges, but Cassidy, drawing on his experience, set them toward the higher end of the range. "These are combat aircraft," he explained to Hendricks, who was learning the process. "The pilots need crisp, immediate response, especially in emergency situations. A little extra tension won't hurt anything, but sluggish controls could get someone killed." By evening, the control systems were complete and tested. Cassidy sat in the pilot's seat, working the yoke and rudder pedals while crew members positioned at the wings and tail visually confirmed that every control surface moved precisely as commanded, with no binding, no delay, and no unusual resistance. "She feels good," Cassidy said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Better than good, actually. These controls are probably tighter than they were when she was new." The final major task was the engines. The number 3 engine, which had been destroyed in the attack, had already been replaced by the previous maintenance team. But Cassidy insisted on pulling the cowlings on all 4 engines and conducting thorough inspections. "An engine that looks fine can have problems that only show up under load," he explained. "We're going to check valve clearances, magneto timing, everything. When this bird takes off for her test flight, I want to know that every engine is perfect." The engine inspections revealed minor issues. Nothing critical, but dozens of small adjustments that improve performance and reliability. Cassidy worked through the night again, this time with Cole at his side, making timing adjustments that required precision down to fractions of a degree. "Frank, it's 0300, Cole said at one point. "You've been awake for over 20 hours. You need a rest." "I'll rest when she flies," Cassidy replied, Not looking up from the magneto he was adjusting. We've got 1 day left before the test flight. 1 day to make sure everything we've done is right. I'm not going to waste it sleeping. Cole shook his head but stayed at his post, helping with the work. He'd come to understand that Cassidy's dedication wasn't just about fixing an aircraft. It was about honoring the men who would trust their lives to this machine, about proving that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle, about making sure that Lieutenant Morrison's Lucky Bird would fly again and continue her legacy. As dawn broke on day 6, Liberty's last dance looked like a bomber again. The gaping wounds in her fuselage had been patched and sealed. The damaged wing showed no external signs of the extensive internal repairs. Fresh paint covered the areas where metal had been replaced. To a casual observer, she appeared ready to fly. But Cassidy knew that appearances meant nothing. The real test was still to come. The systems checks, the engine runs, and ultimately the test flight that would prove whether all their work had been worth it. 24 hours remained, and there was still a mountain of work ahead. Systems check. The 6th day dawned cold and gray, with a steady drizzle that turned the airfield into a patchwork of puddles and mud. Inside the hangar, Frank Cassidy stood before his exhausted crew, with a clipboard in hand and dark circles under his eyes that testified to the 3 consecutive nights he'd worked with minimal sleep. "Gentlemen, today is about verification," he began, his voice hoarse but firm. "We've rebuilt this aircraft from the inside out. Now we need to prove that every system works not just individually, but together. A bomber is more than the sum of its parts. It's a complex machine where every system depends on every other system. Today, we find out if we got it right." The systems check began with the electrical system. With the aircraft's batteries fully charged and auxiliary power connected, they energized every circuit one at a time, checking voltage, amperage, and proper function. Hendricks sat in the cockpit, methodically working through switches and controls while Martinelli and others monitored the actual systems being activated. "Pitot heat," check, Hendricks called out. "Confirmed. Heating elements drawing proper current," came the response from the wing. "Fuel transfer pumps," check. "Confirmed. All pumps running and showing proper pressure." The process continued for hours, with each system requiring not just activation but verification under various conditions. They cycled the landing gear up and down 15 times, watching hydraulic pressures, listening for unusual sounds, checking for fluid leaks. They tested the bomb bay doors through their full range of motion, ensuring the mechanical linkages and electric motors worked in perfect harmony. They activated the turret systems, watching the ball turret, top turret, and tail guns rotate through their traverses even though the actual weapons had been removed for maintenance. By noon, they had verified that every electrical and hydraulic system functioned properly in isolation. Now came the more complex task, running multiple systems simultaneously to check for interaction problems. In aircraft, especially complex bombers like the B-17, systems could test perfectly when run individually but fail when multiple systems demanded power or created conflicting mechanical forces. "All right, we're going to simulate a combat scenario," Cassidy announced. "Hendricks, I want you to cycle the landing gear while Martinelli opens and closes the bomb bay doors. Cole, you'll be operating the turret systems. We need to know that the hydraulic system can handle maximum demand from all systems at once." This was the critical test, the one that would reveal whether the repaired hydraulic pump and rerouted lines could handle the stress of actual operations. They ran the test 3 times, and each time the systems performed flawlessly, with hydraulic pressure remaining steady even under maximum load. "Hydraulics are solid," Martinelli reported, a grin spreading across his grease-stained face. "That modified pump is actually maintaining pressure better than the original specification." The afternoon was devoted to the engines. They'd already inspected and tuned all 4 engines, but now they needed to run them under load to verify that everything worked correctly. The hangar doors were opened, and the bomber was carefully towed out to the hard stand, where they could run the engines without endangering the hangar or other aircraft. Major Hennigan and Captain Wheeler appeared as the crew was preparing for the engine runs, along with a small crowd of other personnel who'd heard about the ambitious repair project. Word had spread through the base about the miracle mechanic from D-Day and his determination to restore the supposedly unfixable bomber. Mr. Cassidy, Hennigan greeted him. I understand you're about ready for engine runs. Yes, sir. We'll start with individual engine tests, checking magnetos, prop governors, and engine performance. Then we'll run all 4 engines together and verify that we're getting proper, synchronized operation. Wheeler looked at the bomber with undisguised skepticism. I still think you're taking an enormous risk. If anything goes wrong during these tests, it could destroy the aircraft completely. Cassidy met his gaze evenly. Captain, with respect, the only way to know if an aircraft can fly is to test it. We've done everything by the book, and then some. These engines are in better condition than they were before Bremen. The airframe is stronger than original specification in the repaired areas. If she's going to fail, better to find out now on the ground than at 20,000 feet. The first engine to be tested was number 1, the outermost engine on the port wing. Hendricks, who had proven himself during the repair process, was given the honor of occupying the pilot's seat for the engine runs. Cassidy stood outside with fire extinguishers ready and his hand on a kill switch that could shut down the engines if anything went wrong. Number 1 engine, clear to start, Cassidy called out. The Wright Cyclone engine coughed, backfired once, then caught with a roar that echoed across the airfield. The propeller blurred into an invisible disk as Hendricks brought the engine up to idle speed. Cassidy watched the exhaust, listening to the engine's voice, checking for any signs of trouble. After a minute at idle, he signaled for Hendricks to advance the throttle. The engine's note deepened as the power increased. Cassidy checked his instruments. Oil pressure steady, cylinder head temperature rising normally, no unusual vibrations. He signaled for Hendricks to check the magnetos, ensuring that both ignition systems were functioning properly. The engine stumbled briefly as Hendricks switched to single magneto operation, then smoothed out again. Perfect. Number 1 engine, shut down, Cassidy ordered. They repeated the process with engines 2, 3, and 4. The newly replaced number 3 engine ran slightly rougher than the others at first, but after a few minutes of warm-up, it smoothed out and performed perfectly. Each engine passed its individual tests with flying colors. Now we run all 4 together, Cassidy announced. This is where we find out if the airframe modifications have affected anything. With all 4 engines running, the noise was tremendous. The bomber strained against her wheel chocks, 12,000 horsepower trying to push her across the hardstand. Cassidy monitored everything. Engine synchronization, vibration levels, structural stress points where their repairs met the original airframe. He walked slowly around the aircraft, looking and listening for anything amiss. After 20 minutes of full operation, including several throttle cycles that brought the engines from idle to near maximum power, Cassidy signaled for shutdown. As the propellers windmilled to a stop and silence gradually returned to the airfield, he allowed himself a small smile. She sounds beautiful, Cole said, coming to stand beside him. She does, Cassidy agreed. But sound is only part of it. Come on, we need to do a complete post-run inspection. Any problems that exist will show up as hot spots, leaks, or loosened components after a hard engine run. The post-run inspection took another 2 hours, but revealed nothing concerning. A few minor oil seeps that were well within acceptable limits. Some heat discoloration on exhaust components that was completely normal, but nothing that indicated any problems with their repairs or the aircraft's overall condition. As evening approached, Major Hennigan approached Cassidy one final time. I have to admit, Mr. Cassidy, I'm impressed. When you arrived 6 days ago, I gave you a week because I didn't think you could succeed, and I didn't want to waste more time arguing about it. But you've proven me wrong. Thank you, sir, but we're not done yet. Tomorrow morning, we flight test her. That's the real proof. About that, Hennigan said, I've arranged for Captain Thomas Burke to pilot the test flight. He's one of our most experienced B-17 pilots, with over 50 missions. He'll have a full crew with him, co-pilot, flight engineer, and bombardier. If there's any problem, they'll be able to handle it. Cassidy nodded. That's good. I'd like to fly with them, if possible. I want to be aboard to monitor the systems during the flight. Hennigan hesitated. That's irregular. You're not technically part of this unit, and... Sir, I've spent 6 days rebuilding this aircraft. I know every rivet, every wire, every modified system. If something goes wrong, I'm the best chance they have of fixing it in the air, or at least understanding what went wrong. And if everything goes right, I like to be there to see it. After a long moment, Hennigan nodded. All right, be here at 0600 hours. We'll brief at 0630 and wheels up at 0700. The test flight will last approximately 2 hours, including various maneuvers to test handling characteristics and system performance under flight conditions. As the major walked away, Cole clapped Cassidy on the shoulder. You did it, Frank. 6 days ago, this bird was scrap metal. Tomorrow, she flies. Cassidy looked at Liberty's last dance, now buttoned up and looking every inch a proud bomber again. She flies if everything works. We've done the best we can, but flight testing is where you discover the things you couldn't anticipate on the ground. Get everyone together. I want one more walk-around inspection before we call it a day. The crew gathered for a final inspection of their work. They walked around the aircraft in the gathering dusk, each man reflecting on what they'd accomplished. 6 days to do what the best maintenance officers on the base had said was impossible. 6 days of 16-hour shifts, of problem-solving on the fly, of dedication to a task that had seemed insurmountable. I want each of you to know, Cassidy said as they finished their inspection, that what we've done here matters. Not just because we've saved an aircraft, but because we've proven something important, that skill, determination, and willingness to think beyond the manual can overcome obstacles that seem impossible. The bomber we've rebuilt is stronger than she was before. The crew that flies her tomorrow will be flying the safest B-17 in the entire 8th Air Force. You should all be proud of that. As the crew dispersed to get some well-earned rest, Cassidy remained behind for a few minutes, alone with the bomber in the quiet evening. He'd worked on hundreds of aircraft during his time at Boeing and during the war, but this one felt different. This one had been a personal challenge, a test of everything he'd learned and developed through years of experience. Tomorrow would tell whether his confidence had been justified or misplaced. Tomorrow, Liberty's last dance would either soar or fail, and with her, the reputation of the legendary mechanic from D-Day would rise or fall. He stubbed out his cigarette and headed for his bunk. 5 hours of sleep, then the most important day of the entire project. One way or another, by tomorrow afternoon, they would know if the impossible had been achieved. First flight. The morning of the 7th day broke clear and cold, a high-pressure system having pushed through during the night to leave the sky a brilliant, endless blue. Frank Cassidy had been awake since 0430, walking the flight line, watching the ground crews prepare Liberty's last dance for her test flight. The bomber sat on the hard stand, her freshly painted aluminum skin gleaming in the early morning light, looking for all the world like she'd never been damaged at all. At 0600, Cassidy met Captain Thomas Burke in the briefing room. Burke was a lanky Virginian with close-cropped red hair and a reputation for being one of the steadiest pilots in the squadron. He'd flown his own bomber through some of the worst flak over Germany and brought his crew home safely every time. If anyone could evaluate the airworthiness of their repairs, it was Burke. Mr. Cassidy, Burke said, extending his hand. I've been hearing about your work all week. Half the base thinks you're a miracle worker, and the other half thinks you're crazy. I'm curious to find out which side is right. Call me Frank, and I hope I'm a little of both. Crazy enough to attempt it, skilled enough to pull it off. Burke smiled. Fair enough. Here's how we'll run the test flight. First, we'll do a careful taxi test, checking control response and braking. If that goes well, we'll proceed to takeoff. I'll keep us at 3,000 feet for the first phase, running through basic maneuvers, turns, climbs, descents. Then we'll increase altitude to 10,000 feet and put her through more aggressive maneuvers, testing the airframe under stress. Finally, we'll run through emergency procedures, single engine operation, rapid descent, everything that might happen in combat. If she passes all that, she's cleared for combat operations. Cassidy nodded. I've prepared a checklist of specific items I'd like monitored during the flight, focusing on the areas we repaired. Hydraulic pressure, structural flex in the repaired wing section, engine performance, and control response. I'll have Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to your late pilot friend, handle the flight engineer duties. He'll be watching your instruments like a hawk. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering emergency procedures, abort criteria, and communication protocols. Then it was time. The crew assembled at the bomber. Burke and his co-pilot, Lieutenant James Riley, Morrison at the flight engineer station, a bombardier named Sergeant Carl Woods, and Cassidy, who would monitor the repairs from the radio operator's position. As they walked out to the aircraft, Cassidy's crew was there to see them off. Cole, Martinelli, Hendricks, and the others had all given up sleep to witness this moment. Major Hennigan and Captain Wheeler were also present, along with what seemed like half the base personnel. No pressure, Burke murmured to Cassidy as they approached the bomber. Just everyone on base watching to see if we crash. Cassidy managed a tight smile. She won't crash. She's stronger now than she ever was. They climbed aboard through the nose hatch, and the reality of what they were about to do hit Cassidy with full force. For 6 days, he'd been focused on the mechanical challenges, the problem-solving, the intricate details of repair. Now, he was about to stake his reputation and potentially his life on those repairs. If he'd made a mistake, if there was a flaw they hadn't discovered, the consequences would be catastrophic. Burke settled into the pilot's seat and began the pre-flight checklist, his hands moving with practiced efficiency over switches and controls. Cassidy positioned himself where he could see the hydraulic pressure gauges and structural stress indicators he'd installed. Lieutenant Morrison called out readings as systems came online. Fuel pressure, check. Oil pressure, check. Hydraulics, holding at 1,100 psi, within spec. Electrical system, all buses active. Looks good, skipper. Ground crew, cleared to start engines. Burke called out through the open side window. The ritual of starting 4 massive radial engines began. One by one, the Wright Cyclones coughed to life, their thunder rolling across the airfield. Cassidy watched his instruments intently. Hydraulic pressure remained steady. No unusual vibrations appeared in the airframe. The engines settled into a synchronized roar that was music to his ears. Tower, this is Liberty's last dance. Requesting permission to taxi, Burke said into his microphone. Liberty's last dance. Clear to taxi to runway 27. Wind is 280 at 15 knots. Burke released the brakes, and the bomber began to roll. Immediately, Cassidy was alert to every sensation. The way the aircraft responded to the controls, any unusual sounds or vibrations, the smoothness of the engines. Years of experience had taught him to feel an aircraft's health through subtle cues that most people would never notice. The taxi to the runway took 5 minutes, and Burke used every second to test the controls, the brakes, the steering. As they turned onto the runway, Cassidy allowed himself a moment of hope. So far, everything was perfect. Tower, Liberty's last dance is ready for takeoff. Liberty's last dance, you're cleared for takeoff. Good luck up there. Burke advanced the throttles, and the 4 engines rose to a crescendo. The bomber began to accelerate down the runway, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Cassidy watched the wing, the repaired wing that so many had said could never fly again, and saw it flex slightly under the increasing load. But the flex was normal, symmetrical, showing no signs of structural weakness. Airspeed 60, 70, 80, Riley called out. V1, rotate. Burke pulled back gently on the yoke, and Liberty's last dance lifted into the air. For a heart-stopping moment, Cassidy felt the aircraft's weight shift, felt the stress redistribute through the airframe as the wings took the full burden of flight. His eyes darted between gauges, looking for any sign of trouble. Nothing. The bomber climbed smoothly, her engines singing in perfect harmony, all systems operating normally. Cassidy felt a wave of relief, so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. How's she feel? Morrison asked Burke over the intercom. Like a dream, Burke replied, and there was wonder in his voice. Controls are crisp, no unusual drag, climbing like she wants to touch the stars. Whatever you folks did to her, it worked. They leveled off at 3,000 feet, and Burke began the test sequence. Gentle turns to the left, then right, evaluating control response. Then steeper turns, 45 degrees of bank, feeling how the aircraft handled the increased G-forces. Every maneuver revealed a bomber that flew not just adequately, but superbly. Taking her up to 10,000, Burke announced. Frank, keep a close eye on that wing during the climb. This is where we'll really load it up. The climb put stress on every part of the aircraft. Cassidy watched his instruments and occasionally looked out at the repaired wing section. He could see the reinforcement plates through panels they'd left accessible for this very purpose, and he saw that they were doing exactly what he designed them to do, distributing the load evenly, taking stress off the crack spar, keeping the structure strong. At 10,000 feet, Burke really put the bomber through her paces. Steep diving turns that pushed the airframe to its limits. Rapid throttle changes that tested the engines. A simulated single-engine scenario where Burke shut down engine number 3 and flew on the remaining 3 engines, checking for controllability and performance. She's compensating beautifully, Burke said, genuine admiration in his voice. I've flown dozens of B-17s, and I've never felt one more responsive than this. Your repairs didn't just fix her, they improved her. After an hour of intensive testing, with every system performing flawlessly, Burke made the call. Tower, Liberty's last dance has completed all test maneuvers successfully, requesting permission to return to base. Permission granted, Liberty's last dance. Welcome home. The landing was smooth as silk, Burke greasing the bomber onto the runway with barely a bump. As they taxied back to the hardstand, Cassidy could see his crew waiting, along with Major Hennigan and what looked like half the base. When Burke finally shut down the engines and they climbed out of the aircraft, the reception was tumultuous. Cole was the first to reach Cassidy, grabbing him in a bear hug. You did it. You magnificent son of a gun. You actually did it. Major Hennigan approached with Captain Wheeler, both men wearing expressions of amazement. Mr. Cassidy, Hennigan said formally, then broke into a broad smile. Frank, that was one of the most remarkable things I've ever witnessed. Captain Burke's report is glowing. He says this bomber flies better than any he's tested. Burke himself emerged from the aircraft and came over to shake Cassidy's hand. Frank, I owe you an apology. I thought this was going to be a disaster waiting to happen. Instead, you've given us a bomber that's going to save lives. She's combat ready, no question. As the celebration continued, Cassidy found himself surrounded by his crew. These men who had trusted his vision, who had worked themselves to exhaustion following his unconventional methods, who had believed in him when the rest of the world had doubts. Listen, Cassidy said, his voice carrying over the crowd. This wasn't just my achievement. Every person who worked on this aircraft contributed to making her fly. This is what happens when skilled people come together with a common purpose and refuse to accept that something is impossible. Be proud of what we accomplished here. Later that evening, as the excitement died down and people returned to their regular duties, Cassidy found himself alone with Liberty's last dance one final time. He ran his hand along her fuselage, feeling the patches and repairs that were invisible to the eye, but that he knew were there. You flew beautifully, girl, he said softly. Your old crew would be proud. Morrison would be proud. Talking to aircraft now? A voice said behind him. Cassidy turned to find Major Hennigan approaching. Just saying goodbye, sir. My work here is done. About that, Hennigan said. I've been thinking. We have 3 other B-17s on this base with damage that's been declared too extensive for field repair. And I'm sure other bases have similar problems. What would you say to staying on as a special consultant? We could use someone with your skills and your willingness to attempt the impossible. Cassidy was quiet for a moment, considering. He'd arrived at Thorpe Abbotts a week ago, intending only to fix one bomber as a favor to a fallen pilot he'd known briefly. But in the process, he'd rediscovered something he'd lost on the beaches of Normandy. A sense of purpose, a mission that mattered. I'd say yes, Major. On one condition. Name it. My crew, Cole, Martinelli, Hendricks, and the others, they come with me. They've proven they can think outside the manual and do the impossible. We're a team now. Hennigan smiled. Done. Welcome to the permanent staff of Thorpe Abbotts, Frank. Something tells me we're going to accomplish great things together. As the Major walked away, Cassidy lit a cigarette and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. Somewhere up there, German fighters and flak guns waited to challenge the bombers that would fly against them. But now, at least, one more bomber would be ready to face that challenge. One more crew would have a reliable aircraft beneath them. The legend of the mechanic from D-Day had been proven true. And this, Cassidy knew, was only the beginning. The mission. 3 weeks after Liberty's last dance returned to flight status, she stood on the hard stand in the pre-dawn darkness, being prepared for her first combat mission since the disastrous Bremen raid. The ground crew moved with practiced efficiency, loading bombs, topping off fuel tanks, checking systems one final time. Frank Cassidy watched from a distance, a mix of pride and apprehension churning in his gut. He'd rebuilt 2 more bombers in the intervening weeks, both with damage that base maintenance had declared unrepairable. His reputation had spread beyond Thorpe Abbott's, and requests for his expertise were coming in from other bases across England. But Liberty's last dance remained special. She was his first, his proof of concept, the aircraft that had established everything that followed. "She's going to Berlin today," Major Hennigan said, coming to stand beside Cassidy. "Deep penetration raid. Maximum bomb load. The new crew has been training hard. Lieutenant Walter Grant is their pilot. Good man, steady nerves. He specifically requested this aircraft when he heard her history." Cassidy nodded, still watching the preparations. How many missions does this make for her? Including the ones before she was damaged. Today will be Mission 33. One more than Morrison flew. They stood in companionable silence as the new crew arrived and began their pre-flight walk-around. Lieutenant Grant paused when he reached the repaired wing section, running his hand along the smooth, aluminum skin that concealed the reinforcement plates beneath. He seemed to sense the care that had gone into the repair, the determination that had brought this aircraft back from the brink of scrapping. The briefing had been held at 0400 hours, revealing the target: the Daimler-Benz tank engine factory in the Berlin suburb of Marienfeld. It was a maximum effort mission, with every available bomber in the 8th Air Force participating. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition and intense flak. The kind of mission that separated the merely good aircraft from the truly exceptional ones. As the crew climbed aboard, Cassidy noticed something that made him smile. Painted on the nose, just below the original nose art, with a new addition, a small wrench and the words "Cassidy's Miracle" in neat lettering. Someone, he suspected the crew chief, had added it as a tribute to the repair work. "You made her famous," Hennigan observed. "The legend of the bomber that wouldn't die." "She makes herself famous," Cassidy replied. "I just gave her the chance." The engines started, one by one, their familiar roar rolling across the airfield. 23 other bombers were starting their engines too, the sound building to a thunderous symphony that Cassidy felt in his chest. This was the sound of American industrial might being turned against Nazi Germany. The sound of bombers built in factories where he'd worked, maintained by mechanics he'd trained, flying because dedicated people refused to let them fail. Liberty's last dance taxied out with her group, taking her position in the formation. As she rolled past where Cassidy stood, he saw Grant in the pilot's seat, concentrating on his instruments, preparing himself for the grueling mission ahead. The lieutenant caught sight of Cassidy and gave him a quick thumbs up, a gesture of confidence in the aircraft and the work that had restored her. Then she was gone, accelerating down the runway and lifting into the gray morning sky. 23 other bombers followed, forming up into their combat boxes, layers of aircraft providing mutual defensive fire against the German fighters that would soon be trying to kill them all. The hours that followed were among the longest of Cassidy's life. He tried to work on the other bombers, to focus on the tasks at hand, but his mind kept returning to Liberty's last dance and her crew. Were his repairs holding up? Was the wing structure maintaining its integrity under combat loads and violent maneuvers? Had he missed something, some small flaw that would reveal itself at the worst possible moment? Cole found him in the maintenance hangar around noon, staring at nothing. "Frank, you got to stop torturing yourself. That bomber is as solid as they come." "You know it, I know it. Everyone who worked on her knows it." "Knowing and believing are two different things," Cassidy replied. Up there right now, my work is being tested by the worst conditions imaginable. If something fails, if something fails, it won't be because of anything you did or didn't do. You rebuilt that aircraft to standards higher than factory original. Whatever happens today, it won't be on you. But Cassidy couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility. He'd touched every part of that bomber, made hundreds of decisions about how to repair and reinforce her structure. The crew flying her today was trusting those decisions with their lives. The afternoon dragged on. Radio operators monitoring the mission frequencies reported heavy fighting over Germany. Several bombers had been shot down, and more were reporting battle damage. The group from Thorpe Abbotts had taken losses, 2 aircraft confirmed destroyed, 3 more so badly damaged they diverted to emergency airfields closer to the coast. As evening approached, the surviving bombers began to return. Cassidy stood on the control tower's observation deck, binoculars in hand, watching the sky. One by one, the battle-scarred aircraft appeared, some trailing smoke, others with visible damage to wings or fuselage. The tower crew called out identifications as each bomber was identified. That's High Time. That's Southern Belle. Rambler Rose, she's got 1 engine out. Mama's Boy, number 3, is windmilling. Cassidy's hands tightened on the binoculars. Where is she? Where was Liberty's last dance? Then he saw her, and his heart sank. She was trailing the main formation, flying lower than the others, with visible damage to her tail section. The number 2 engine was feathered, its propeller stopped, and there were holes punched through the vertical stabilizer that he could see even from this distance. Liberty's last dance. You are cleared for immediate landing, the tower controller said, his voice tense. Fire equipment is standing by. Grant's voice came back over the radio, calm despite the circumstances. Roger, tower. We took some hits over the target, but she's flying true, coming in on 3 engines and a prayer. The bomber lined up on final approach, lower and slower than normal due to the dead engine. Cassidy held his breath as she crossed the runway threshold, Grant compensating for the asymmetric thrust with rudder pressure. The landing wasn't pretty. She hit hard, bounced once, then settled onto the runway with her brakes squealing. But she was down, she was safe, and she brought her crew home. Cassidy was the first to reach the aircraft as it taxied to its hardstand. The damage was worse than he'd thought. Not just the tail section and the engine, but dozens of smaller holes from flak and fighter cannon fire. But the structural repairs he'd made were intact. The wing section showed no signs of failure, despite obvious battle damage nearby. The reinforcement plates had done their job. Grant climbed out, exhausted but grinning. Frank, your miracle machine just saved 10 lives today. We took direct hits from 2 different 109s and flak over the target that should have knocked us out of the sky. But she kept flying. That wing repair of yours took a 20mm cannon round that would have torn the wing off any other aircraft, but your reinforcement plates absorbed the impact and distributed the load. You didn't just fix this bird. You armor-plated her. Cassidy walked around the bomber, assessing the damage. It was extensive, but all reparable. More importantly, none of the critical structural elements he'd worked on had failed. The aircraft had performed exactly as he'd designed her to perform, absorbing punishment and protecting her crew. She's going to need some work, Cassidy said, running his hand over a hole in the fuselage large enough to stick his arm through. But nothing we can't fix. How did she handle? Like a dream, right up until we started taking fire. Even with the engine out, the controls stayed responsive. The hydraulic system kept working even after we took hits that severed some of the lines. Your bypass modifications kept us flying when we should have been going down. Over the next hour, as the crew was debriefed and the full extent of the mission's success became clear, the target had been hit hard, with significant damage to the factory. Cassidy and his team began documenting the battle damage. It was a sobering reminder that no matter how well an aircraft was maintained, combat was brutal and unforgiving. But it was also a validation. Liberty's last dance had faced the worst that the German defenses could throw at her, and she'd survived because the repairs and modifications Cassidy had made had given her structural resilience beyond standard specifications. The aircraft that everyone had wanted to scrap had proven herself in the crucible of combat. That evening, Major Hennigan convened a special meeting in the operations briefing room. The entire maintenance crew was there, along with several senior officers from 8th Air Force Headquarters who had flown in specifically for this meeting. "Gentlemen," Hennigan began, "today's mission results have proven something remarkable. Of the 24 aircraft from this base that flew to Berlin, we lost 2 and had 5 others so badly damaged they'll be out of service for weeks. But the aircraft that took some of the heaviest fire, Liberty's Last Dance, is already being repaired and will fly again within days. The difference? The repair techniques developed by Frank Cassidy and his team." A colonel from headquarters stood up. "Mr. Cassidy, I've reviewed the reports on your repair work, and frankly, they read like science fiction. You've accomplished things that our engineering staff said were impossible. Headquarters wants to know if these techniques can be standardized, taught to other maintenance crews." Cassidy stood, uncomfortable with the attention. "Sir, the techniques aren't revolutionary. They're based on understanding how stress flows through aircraft structures and how to reinforce weak points. The principles can definitely be taught. What can't be taught as easily is the willingness to look beyond the manual, to see problems from new angles. Nevertheless," the colonel continued, "we want you to develop a training program. We're establishing a new advanced repair facility at this base, and you'll lead it. Your team will train other maintenance crews from across the 8th Air Force in these advanced techniques. We need to preserve every aircraft we can. The replacements from the States aren't coming fast enough to offset our losses." As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Cole approached Cassidy. "Advanced Repair Facility. That a fancy way of saying we're going to be the busiest mechanics in England?" Cassidy smiled. "That's exactly what it means. But think about it, Marcus. Every bomber we save is 10 men who get to go home to their families. Every aircraft we keep flying is more bombs on target, bringing this war closer to an end. This matters." "It does," Cole agreed. "By the way, the boys and I have been talking. We want to make this official. You're the best teacher we've ever had, the best mechanic we've ever worked with. We want to stay with you, wherever this leads." Cassidy felt a surge of emotion that he quickly suppressed. These men had started as strangers 3 weeks ago, assigned to him because no one else would work on a supposedly unfixable bomber. Now they were a team, bonded by the shared experience of achieving the impossible. "Then let's make this count," Cassidy said. "Let's save every bird we can, train every mechanic we can, and make damn sure that when this war ends, it's because we gave our boys the tools they needed to win it." That night, as Cassidy did his final walk-around of Liberty's Last Dance, examining the new damage by flashlight, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the factory floors in Seattle to the beaches of Normandy, from the chaos of D-Day to this airbase in England, every experience had prepared him for this moment. Every aircraft he'd worked on had taught him something new. The bomber was more than a machine to him now. She was a symbol of resilience, of the American spirit that refused to quit even when the odds seemed impossible. Morrison had kept her flying through 31 missions. Cassidy had brought her back from the dead. Grant and his crew had proven her worth in combat. And now, she would fly again, a testament to the skill and dedication of everyone who'd touched her. "You've got a lot more missions in you, girl," Cassidy said softly, patching one of the smaller holes with his hand. "And I'm going to make damn sure you're ready for every single one of them." The legend of the mechanic from D-Day and his miraculous repairs was no longer just a story. It was a proven reality, saving lives and changing how the Air Force approached field maintenance. And for Frank Cassidy, it was just the beginning of a legacy that would long outlast the war. Legacy. The winter of 1945 brought brutal cold to England, but inside the advanced repair facility at Thorpe Abbotts, the work never stopped. Frank Cassidy's operation had grown from a single crew working on one bomber to a dedicated hangar with 30 trained mechanics and a waiting list of damaged aircraft that stretched across 3 airfields. His techniques had been codified into training manuals, but Cassidy insisted on personally training every mechanic who came through the facility, ensuring they understood not just the procedures, but the principles behind them. Liberty's Last Dance had become a legend across the 8th Air Force. She'd flown 15 more missions since Berlin, taking damage on several of them, but always bringing her crew home. Word had spread that the bomber was lucky, that crews who flew her survived when others didn't. Cassidy knew the truth. It wasn't luck, it was engineering and careful maintenance. But he never corrected the rumors. If believing in luck helped the crews face the terror of combat, who was he to take that away from them? On a gray February morning, Cassidy stood in his office, a small space carved out of the corner of the hangar, reviewing reports on the latest batch of repairs when Major Hennigan entered. "Frank, we've got a situation," Hennigan said, his expression grim. "There's a bomber coming in from the raid on Dresden. Heavy damage, pilot barely maintaining control. Tower thinks she's going to crash, but the pilot insists he can make it. He says he's flying Liberty's last dance." Cassidy's blood ran cold. Grant's crew was on that mission. He grabbed his jacket and ran for the flight line, Hennigan following close behind. They reached the tower just as the stricken bomber came into view, and what Cassidy saw made his heart sink. The aircraft was a flying wreck. The entire nose section was shattered, the plexiglass bombardier position blown away. The number 4 engine was gone, literally torn from its mounting and trailing debris. The port wing had a huge section of skin peeled back, exposing the internal structure. She was flying lower and slower than any bomber Cassidy had ever seen still airborne, and she was trailing smoke from multiple fires that the crew had somehow managed to control. "Jesus Christ," Hennigan breathed. "How is she still flying?" Cassidy's trained, I was already assessing the damage, understanding what was keeping the aircraft aloft. The reinforcement plates he'd installed were visible through the torn wing skin, and he could see they were bearing loads far beyond their design specifications. The modified hydraulic system was maintaining pressure even though several lines were clearly severed, the backup routing he'd installed compensating for the lost systems. "She's flying because every modification we made is working exactly as designed," Cassidy said quietly. "But she's barely holding together. Grant is going to need perfect conditions to land her." The tower controller was in constant communication with Grant, offering advice, preparing emergency services. But the pilot's voice remained eerily calm as he described his situation and his intention to land, despite the tower's suggestions to have the crew bail out. "Negative, tower. My entire crew is still alive, and I'm not losing them now. This bird has brought us home every single time, and she's going to do it one more time. Cassidy built her too strong to fail us now." The approach was agonizing to watch. Grant brought the crippled bomber in with 3 engines and emergency hydraulics, fighting every second to maintain control. The aircraft was barely controllable, yawing and rolling despite Grant's best efforts. But somehow, impossibly, he lined up on the runway. The landing was more controlled crash than normal touchdown. The bomber hit hard, the damaged landing gear collapsing on one side, sending the aircraft skidding down the runway in a shower of sparks. But the structural integrity held. The wing didn't tear off. The fuselage didn't break apart. She slid to a stop, battered and broken, but whole, and 10 men scrambled out alive. Cassidy ran toward the aircraft, his crew following. Grant was the last man out, and when he saw Cassidy, he simply said, "Your bird saved us." I don't know how, but she did. The damage was catastrophic. As Cassidy walked around the wreck, cataloging the destruction, he realized this was beyond even his abilities to repair. The airframe had taken structural damage that compromised elements he couldn't reinforce without essentially rebuilding the entire aircraft. Liberty's last dance had flown her last mission. "She's done," Cassidy said quietly to Hennigan, who had joined him. "I can salvage parts, but the airframe is finished." That evening, as word spread through the base, something unexpected happened. Crews began gathering around the wrecked bomber, not to scavenge parts, but to pay respects. Someone brought a bottle of whiskey, and toasts were drunk to the aircraft that had refused to die until her crew was safe. Grant's crew told the story of how the bomber had taken hits that should have destroyed her, but kept flying because of Cassidy's repairs and modifications. "She flew 76 missions," Grant said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Morrison flew 31, I flew 15 more, and other crews flew another 30. She was hit by flak, cannon fire, rockets, and machine guns. She lost engines, hydraulics, control surfaces. But she never failed to bring her crew home. Not once. That's the legacy of Frank Cassidy's work. The gathering turned into an impromptu wake for the bomber, with crews sharing stories of seeing Liberty's last dance limp home from missions, her damage so severe that ground crews couldn't believe she was still flying. The legend had grown with each mission, and now, at her end, the aircraft had become a symbol of resilience and the skill of the mechanics who kept the bombers flying. Later, after the crowd dispersed, Cassidy sat alone with the wreck. Cole found him there, staring at the battered fuselage. She lasted longer than anyone thought possible, Cole said. You gave her a second life. She earned it, Cassidy replied. Every modification we made, every reinforcement we installed, it all came together to save lives. That's what matters. You know, headquarters wants you to do a formal write-up of everything we learned from her. They want to incorporate these techniques into the design of the next generation of bombers. Cassidy nodded slowly. The war's winding down. Germany can't hold out much longer, and after that, it'll be Japan. But there'll be other wars, other aircraft that need repair in impossible conditions. If what we learned here helps save lives in the future, then every hour we spent on this bird was worth it. In the weeks that followed, Liberty's last dance was carefully disassembled, her parts salvaged to keep other bombers flying. But Cassidy made sure that certain elements were preserved. The reinforcement plates from the wing, the modified hydraulic pump, examples of the structural repairs that had kept her flying. These were sent to the Air Force Technical Museum, where they would be studied by future generations of engineers and mechanics. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and with it, the urgent need for Cassidy's miracle repairs. But his legacy was already secured. The training program he developed had spread to bases across England and eventually to the Pacific Theater. Hundreds of mechanics had learned his techniques, and thousands of airmen had benefited from the aircraft they'd repaired and maintained. Colonel Morrison, no relation to the pilot, from Air Force Engineering Command came to Thorpe Abbotts in June to personally thank Cassidy for his contributions. Frank, we've analyzed your work, and the conclusion is clear. Your repair techniques and modifications saved dozens of aircraft that would otherwise have been scrapped. That translates to hundreds of lives saved, thousands of successful missions flown. The Air Force would like to offer you a permanent position as a civilian consultant, helping to develop the next generation of combat aircraft. Cassidy considered the offer. The war with Japan was still ongoing, but everyone knew it was just a matter of time. Soon the urgent pressure of wartime would ease, and with it, the need for his particular skills. I appreciate the offer, Colonel, Cassidy finally said, but I think my work here is done. I'm a mechanic, not an engineer. My place is on the factory floor or the flight line, with my hands on actual aircraft, not pushing papers in an office. What will you do? Cassidy smiled. I think I'll go home to Seattle. Boeing's going to be building airliners after the war, and they're going to need people who understand how to make aircraft reliable and safe. That's where I can do the most good. Before he left England, Cassidy made one final visit to where Liberty's last dance had met her end. The wreck was gone now, salvaged for parts, but the hard stand remained. In the spring sunshine, with birds singing and the war gradually becoming memory, Cassidy stood where the bomber had last rested. He thought about Morrison, the pilot who'd kept her flying through 31 missions and had died believing his lucky bird was finished. He thought about Grant and the other crews who'd trusted their lives to his repairs. He thought about Cole, Martinelli, Hendricks, and all the others who'd worked alongside him, proving that dedication and skill could overcome any obstacle. We did good work, Cassidy said aloud to the empty air. You and me both, girl. We did good work. As he turned to leave, he noticed someone had placed a small plaque on the hard stand, marking where Liberty's last dance had stood. It read, "Here stood a bomber that refused to die, damaged beyond repair. She was restored by the skill and determination of S/SGD Frank Cassidy and his crew. She flew 76 combat missions and never failed to bring her crew home. Remember the aircraft, remember the crews, remember the mechanics who kept them flying." Cassidy read it twice, then nodded in satisfaction. That was legacy enough. Not medals or commendations, but the simple truth that he'd done his job well, and lives had been saved because of it. He returned to the United States in July 1945, just as the war with Japan was entering its final phase. True to his word, he went back to Boeing in Seattle, where he helped design maintenance procedures for the new generation of commercial aircraft that would revolutionize air travel in the post-war world. The techniques he'd pioneered in the crucible of war, understanding stress distribution, systematic inspection protocols, creative problem-solving, all found their place in peacetime aviation. Years later, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Cassidy received a letter from the Air Force Museum. They were planning an exhibit on field maintenance during World War II, and they wanted to honor his work. Would he attend the opening? Cassidy, now in his 70s but still sharp-eyed and steady-handed, made the journey. The exhibit featured the actual reinforcement plates from Liberty's Last Dance, displayed alongside photographs and documents detailing the repair process. There was even a video interview with Walter Grant, now a successful airline pilot, talking about how Cassidy's modifications had saved his life. But what moved Cassidy most was a letter, yellowed with age, that the museum had acquired. It was written by Morrison's widow, who had heard the story of how her husband's Lucky Bomber had flown again after his death, carrying other crews safely home. She wrote, "Frank Cassidy gave my husband's aircraft a second life, and in doing so, honored his memory. Every crew that flew Liberty's Last Dance after John's death made it home safely. That brings me comfort, knowing that his lucky bird continued to protect others even after she couldn't protect him." Mr. Cassidy's work was more than just mechanical repair. It was an act of love for all the young men who entrusted their lives to those magnificent machines. As Cassidy stood in the museum, surrounded by young people who had never known war, who flew in commercial jets without thinking about the legacy of the bombers that had come before, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The work he'd done 50 years ago, the impossible repairs and creative solutions, had mattered. Lives had been saved, lessons had been learned, and the legacy of that one extraordinary week at Thorpe Abbotts had rippled forward through decades. Cole found him there, old now but still recognizable. They'd stayed in touch over the years, occasional letters and rare visits. "Still thinking about that damn bomber?" Cole asked with a smile. "Always," Cassidy admitted. "She taught me that impossible is just a word people use when they don't want to try hard enough." Everything after her was easy by comparison. They stood together, two old mechanics remembering a time when the fate of the world had hung in the balance, and their small corner of the war had been keeping broken machines flying. It seemed like another lifetime, another world. But the lessons remained, that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle, that creative thinking could solve any problem. That dedication to excellence saved lives. "You know what the best part is?" Cole said finally. "Kids today are flying in aircraft that are safer and more reliable because of what we learned back then. Every technique you developed, every modification you made to Liberty's Last Dance, it all fed into how aircraft are maintained today. That's real legacy." Cassidy nodded, looking at the reinforcement plates behind the glass. They were just pieces of metal, carefully shaped and precisely installed. But they represented something more. The refusal to accept defeat, the determination to find solutions where others saw only problems, the understanding that sometimes the manual was wrong and you had to trust your experience and intuition. "The bomber that wouldn't die," Cassidy said softly, "and the mechanic who refused to let her." As they left the museum together, two old men who had once been young and strong and had done impossible things, Cassidy felt at peace. The work had mattered. The legacy endured. And somewhere, in the heart of every mechanic who looked at a broken aircraft and saw not what was but what could be, the spirit of Liberty's Last Dance lived on. The story of the legendary mechanic from D-Day who had arrived when all hope was lost and had achieved the impossible had become more than just a war story. It had become a lesson about the power of expertise, determination, and a refusal to accept that anything worth doing was truly impossible. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy of all.